What if one of the toughest fighters in UFC history ended his legendary career by fighting the biggest superstar the sport has ever seen? At 42 years old, after nearly 50 brutal UFC wars, Jim Miller just called out Conor McGregor. And somehow, it doesn't sound crazy at all. Because while McGregor is preparing for a comeback, Jim Miller is quietly building one of the most unbelievable stories in MMA history. And now, their paths might finally collide. Jim Miller was never supposed to still be here. Not at 42 years old. Not after almost 5 decades worth of damage inside the Octagon. And definitely not after fighting through Lyme disease, injuries, exhaustion, and years of punishment that would have broken most fighters long ago. But somehow, Jim Miller just keeps winning. At UFC 328, Miller stepped into the cage for the 47th time in UFC history and submitted Jared Gordon in another gritty performance that reminded everyone exactly why fans respect him so much. And after the fight, instead of slowing down, he signed a brand new 5-fight deal. Think about that for a second. Most fighters are retired before they even reach half the number of UFC fights Miller already has. But Jim Miller isn't chasing money anymore. He's chasing history. His goal is simple: 50 UFC fights. A record that might never be broken. And honestly, the closer he gets, the more unreal the story becomes. Because this isn't some washed-up veteran hanging around for paychecks. Jim Miller is still dangerous, still winning, still surviving in the most brutal sport on earth. And after UFC 328, he revealed something that instantly got MMA fans talking. A potential fight with Conor McGregor. Yeah, that Conor McGregor. After his victory, Miller was asked what comes next. And at first, he gave the classic veteran answer: whoever. But then, he smiled and dropped a line that immediately exploded across the MMA world. I hear there's an Irishman looking for a fight. Just like that, the internet went crazy, because everyone knows exactly who he meant. Conor McGregor, the former two-division UFC champion, the biggest pay-per-view draw in MMA history, the man who hasn't fought in years, but still dominates headlines like no one else. And suddenly, fans started imagining it. Conor McGregor versus Jim Miller. The superstar versus the Iron Man. The biggest name in UFC history against one of the toughest fighters to ever enter the cage. And honestly, it's kinda perfect. See, Jim Miller has never been the loudest fighter. He never built his career on trash talk. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't controversial. He just fought. Again, and again, and again, while entire generations of fighters came and went. Jim Miller stayed. That's why so many hardcore fans respect him. Because he represents something rare in modern MMA. Durability, discipline, longevity. The guy has seen every era of the UFC. And through all of it, he kept showing up. But there's another reason this story hits differently. Jim Miller almost retired years ago. And not because he lost faith in himself. His body was literally breaking down. Back in the build-up to UFC 196, Miller was in a terrible place physically. He later admitted he was so exhausted and damaged that even basic training became torture. Other fighters in the gym were sparring, while he was barely jogging on a treadmill. And if he even attempted hard sparring, his body would fall apart for days. Imagine that. A professional fighter, unable to train like a fighter. And the scary part? At the time, he didn't fully understand why. Then came the diagnosis. Lyme disease. A condition that silently drained his energy and nearly destroyed his career completely. For many athletes, that would have been the end. But somehow, Jim Miller fought through it. Not just physically, mentally. Because one of the hardest parts of aging in combat sports isn't the pain. It's accepting reality. Accepting that your body isn't the same anymore. Accepting that younger fighters are coming. Accepting that eventually time wins. But Miller refused to let his story end like that. Instead, he adapted. He trained smarter, protected his body, avoided unnecessary damage, and slowly rebuilt himself. That's why his recent success means so much more than people realize. Every win feels personal. Every walk to the Octagon feels earned. And now, he's only 3 fights away from the number 50. A milestone that feels almost mythical in modern MMA. But here's where things get really interesting. Because Conor McGregor's future is suddenly becoming one of the biggest mysteries in combat sports again. Dana White recently said he expects McGregor to return this summer. Rumors are already swirling about a possible fight with Max Holloway at UFC 329. But nothing is official yet. And with Conor, nothing is ever simple. The injuries, the controversies, the broken comeback promises. For years, fans have heard the same thing. Conor is coming back. But then something always happens. A delay, an injury, another headline, another distraction. And meanwhile, time keeps moving. That's why this Jim Miller call-out feels strangely compelling. Because unlike the massive blockbuster fights people constantly push for McGregor, this one actually has emotion behind it, legacy behind it, story behind it. Think about it. Conor McGregor represents superstardom, money, fame, chaos. But Jim Miller? He represents survival, hard work, consistency, respect. They're complete opposites. And sometimes, that creates the most fascinating fights. Especially now. Because Conor doesn't really need to fight anymore. Financially, he's set for life. He's already become bigger than the UFC itself in many ways. Which means every fight from this point forward is about something different. Legacy, purpose, meaning. So if McGregor really comes back, what kind of story does he want to tell? Does he chase another title? Does he go after revenge fights? Or does he take on dangerous veterans with unforgettable stories like Jim Miller? Because win or lose, people would watch. A lot of people. And honestly, Jim Miller seems completely at peace with wherever this journey goes. That's the part that makes his interviews so powerful. You can hear it in the way he talks. There's no desperation, no panic, no fake confidence, just gratitude. He knows he's near the end. And instead of fearing it, he's embracing it. Miller even said he wants to enjoy every single moment of this final run. The media attention, the fans, the spotlight, everything. Because years ago, he almost lost all of it. That changes a person. When you've already stared retirement in the face, every extra moment feels like a gift. And maybe that's why fans connect with him so deeply now. Because in a sport built on hype, Jim Miller feels real. There's also something poetic about the timing of all this. Back at UFC 100, Jim Miller fought on one of the biggest cards ever. Then he fought again at UFC 200. And now, he's pushing toward UFC history once more. 50 fights. Half 100 appearances inside the toughest promotion in the world. That's not normal. That's legendary. And if one of those final fights happens to be against Conor McGregor, it instantly becomes one of the most fascinating matchups the UFC could make. Not because it determines a title, not because it changes rankings, but because it means something emotionally. For McGregor, it could represent redemption. For Miller, it could become the perfect final chapter. The superstar and the survivor. One chasing relevance again, the other proving he never lost it. But there's another layer to this story nobody talks about enough. Fear. not fear of fighting. Fear of ending badly. That's something every aging fighter carries. The fear of staying too long. The fear of becoming a sad version of yourself. The fear of no longer recognizing the fighter staring back in the mirror. And Jim Miller clearly understands that. That's why he keeps talking about getting to 50 safely. Not recklessly. Not desperately. Safely. He wants to walk away with dignity. With his health. With his head held high. And honestly, that mindset alone already makes his career special. Because combat sports is filled with legends who stayed too long. Jim Miller doesn't want that story. He wants the right ending. And maybe, just maybe, Conor McGregor becomes part of it. Now imagine the atmosphere if this fight actually happens. The cameras, the headlines, the crowd exploding when McGregor walks out. And across from him, a man who's been fighting in the UFC longer than some fans have even been watching the sport. Jim Miller wouldn't enter as the superstar. He'd enter as something else. A living symbol of endurance. The guy who simply refused to disappear. And in a strange way, that might make him more dangerous than people think. Because fighters with nothing left to prove are terrifying. They fight differently. Freer. Calmer. Sharper. And if Conor overlooks him for even a second, things could get very interesting. At the end of the day, nobody knows if this fight will actually happen. Maybe McGregor fights Max Holloway. Maybe he never returns at all. Maybe Jim Miller faces someone completely different on his road to 50. But the fact that this conversation even exists tells you everything about Jim Miller's legacy. After all these years, after all the pain, after all the wars, he's still relevant, still respected, still dangerous. And maybe that's the most impressive achievement of all. Because in a sport where careers disappear overnight, Jim Miller endured. So what do you think? Would Conor McGregor versus Jim Miller actually be a great fight? Or is it just a cool story? And if Jim Miller really reaches 50 UFC fights, will we ever see another fighter break that record again? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the fight game changes fast. And the next crazy UFC story might already be happening.